Much of the following explanation is adapted from Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman's lecture on physics, a section called Electricity in the Atmosphere. For every meter you go up in the air, the voltage increases by around 100 volts, or we could say around 100 volts per yard. We can draw these voltage increases using what are called equipotential lines. Notice that the ground is negative and the sky is positive with respect to each other. According to Feynman, this extends upward to 50 kilometers, or 31 miles, where the air is very conductive. This is the case in fair weather. In stormy weather, like a thunderstorm, things are quite different, and I won't talk about that here. But if this voltage exists between your head and the ground, why don't you get a shock? The reason is that your body is a good enough electrical conductor that standing on the ground, you're basically a part of the ground. The equipotential lines would look like this. There's still effectively 0 volts between the top of your head and ground. Similar effects happen with trees, buildings, and so on. What about the electric current? A downward electrical current exists and consists of positive ions, molecules or clumps of matter that have a positive charge. These ions are moving slowly toward the ground. The current density from these ions is very small, around 10 microamps or 10 picoamps, crossing each square meter or yard every second. So in any small area, there's not a lot of power. And that's the explanation about atmospheric electricity adapted from Feynman's lectures. To take advantage of this atmospheric electricity, we electrically connect one end of a wire to the ground and lift the other end up into the air. In our case, we got good results at around 120 meters or 390 feet up. At 100 volts per meter or 100 volts per yard, that's 12,000 volts between that height and the ground. But just as with you standing on the ground, the wire is an electrical conductor, and so is also at ground potential. Looking at the equipotential lines around the wire, that voltage of 12,000 volts exists between some distance away from the wire and the wire. You can see that the equipotential lines are closest together at the top of the wire. This means the attraction is strongest there, and electrons make their way upward in the wire. Let's look more closely at the top of the wire. We'd put 6 sharp points using sewing pins at the top of that wire, but for ease of illustration I'll draw just one. Notice that because of the sharp shape at the point, the charges are crowded together at that point. Remember also that there are positively charged ions in the air. An electric field exists between the negative charges on the wire and the positive charges in the air. And we can represent that electric field by drawing lines between pairs of opposite charges. Notice that the electric field lines are closer together near the point, meaning the electric field is stronger there. It's strong enough to remove the negative electrons from the sharp point, where they neutralize positive ions. But due to the voltage, there are fresh positive ions moving downward and fresh negative charges coming up from the wire. We now have electricity flowing through the wire. The electric current in that electricity is very weak though. We didn't measure it, but from my experience with electrostatics, I'd estimate it in the low microamps, or more likely even lower. That's not enough to turn an electromagnetic motor, one like you use in everyday life, but it is enough to turn an electrostatic motor, like this Corona motor. The Corona motor consists of a plastic cylinder surrounded by sharp-edged metal blades. Every second one of those blades is connected to the wire going up into the sky. That means that when the wire starts conducting, those blades are now at whatever voltage the top of the wire is up in the sky, though opposite in polarity, positive. That's why you get a shock when you touch one of those wires. Negative charge is then pulled from the plastic cylinder through a gap between the edge of the blade and the cylinder. That leaves the cylinder with the same charge, and since like charges repel, a repulsion occurs that rotates the cylinder. The next blade is connected to earth ground and becomes negatively charged, and since opposite charges attract, it attracts the charged area of the cylinder. It then neutralizes that charged area by taking electrons from the ground. And that's how atmospheric electricity can power an electrostatic motor like a Corona motor.
We get to the very exciting Earth grid that seems to connect all these ancient sites on Earth. By now you should know that this is a magnetic grid. It's not just ley lines or some fancy it's actually very specific energetic patterns that are created by the resonance of the Earth and the magnetic fields that it creates. And the ancients seem to build all these ancient sites on these nodal points and very powerful points on these magnetic grids. And this is an ancient Sumerian text that actually tells us a lot of very important information. This is a real text that comes from the Shoyan collection, and it says, in the distant days, in those days after destinies had been decreed, after An and Enlil had set up regulations for heaven and earth. Regulations for heaven and earth. And Enki, the exalted knowing God, by the rules for heaven and earth, the fixed rules, he set up cities. It seems to tell us that there was some sort of a fixed energy grid in the sky, heaven, and the fixed energy grid on the earth. And based on the energy field in the sky and the earth, they set up the cities on earth on these specific nodal points. And then David Wilcock several years ago discovered that the emblems of the Space Command and the Air Force and so forth in the USA refer to the rules. And they have these bands around the earth, these white bands with these little delta shapes on them. And they refer to those bands around the world as the rules. And they say there's some sort of energetic field around the world. They don't know where it comes from, but it's always been there. Some sort of energetic field up in the sky that this same Sumerian text seems to refer to. They built the cities according to this energetic grid. And here we have the same rules. Read there, it says, the fixed rules. By the rules for heaven and earth, the fixed rules, they set up the cities. And here we have the fixed rules in the sky on the military and Air Force logos. And my friend Paul Grevenstein in South Africa, who's a remarkable guy, but we don't have time for me to talk about him, he actually measured these rules or these energy grids in the sky. He phoned me out of the blue and he was freaking out. He said, I don't know how to tell you this. I don't know who else to tell, but I picked up this bloody energy grid that's up in the sky. It's just everywhere. It's like a matrix. It's like it consists out of ones and zeros. It's like a binary code, powerful energy field up in the sky. And he said he sent up a few energy beams or these devices to try and break it. He says it breaks it momentarily and it instantly reforms. You cannot destroy it. He says you can't break it. It's indestructible. And I just realized that all this ancient stuff that we're dealing with, just like I said, these ancient machines are just advanced technology on a gigantic scale. These obelisks in Egypt, they ring like bells. If you listen to them, they ring like bells, just like those stones in my museum. And when you go into these temples in Egypt, we were told that they were built for this and offering. It's all nonsense, offering and praying. It's just too many pillars, not enough space. When you look at them from this angle, you realize that this is just something very different. And all those pillars clustered together, why would they build them like that? And then the more I looked at it, the more I realized, now inspired by realizing that the stone circles were powerful energy-generating devices, suddenly seeing aerial photographs of these temples in Egypt, I realized that they weren't temples, but they were actually templates. And we're actually looking at gigantic energy circuits, circuit boards on a gigantic scale that we could never have imagined. It's just beyond our imagination. The scale that these guys were building things on is something way out of our perception because we just don't have enough money to do that. And macro processors, gigantic microprocessors become gigantic macro processors. And here we are told that these were places of worship, and then this is where the people lived. No, these are giant bloody macro processors, and that's part of the circuit board. It's what it is, and you can start seeing that the pyramids were the same thing, giant powerhouses, creating huge amounts of energy. And just, you start seeing things and recognizing how all this fits into ancient history. Sacsayhuaman is also just a giant circuit board. When you look at images from the air, you realize it's just a giant circuit board. It's not a fortress on top of a mountain to ward off marauding crowds and guys on horses and spears. No, it's a giant circuit